all set?
Okay, hello and good evening, everybody. I'm speaking today again to Dr. Richard Sakwa, who's a returning guest on the podcast. And the topic, as usual, is the Russian-Ukrainian war. Sadly, it has not ended. And Richard, I'm going to ask you to start again with something you mentioned last time, which is with the first conversation we had, you said this war takes place in a post-colonial context. And can you maybe just re-explain that again and explain why that is so important to understand?
Mm, yes. You could say that this war is a delayed reaction to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Even though at the time, 1991, it was considered relatively bloodless, not entirely, but the long-term shock has never really been resolved. So, in the sense that Ukrainian nationalists see this war as a liberation struggle, not just from communism, but from the Russian Empire. So it goes back 500 years, if not 1,000 years. So there's all sorts of identity issues and elements involved. There's also another specific issue, and that is, as you know, very much in the West, there is this huge ideological push to decolonize everything, decolonize the curriculum in universities. And so That's another context. Of course, in Ukraine, and I think mostly in the West, people misunderstand what decolonization and the whole post colonial thinking was about, because post coloniality is all about hybridity. Is that how a post colonial society will incorporate elements from the former colonizer? That's the language and culture, and of course, the technological legacy, and so much more. Um, but it's always uncomfortable because identities are in flux and you have to find a new identity after colonization. So, and just one final point, there is then on top of all of that, so there's the post-Soviet context, there's this Western decolonization context, which has suddenly gone completely mad. And then you've got this third thing, which is quite fascinating. And this is the whole ideology of decoloniality. Now, this is a concept that developed in Latin America. And again, it's being misapplied to the Ukrainian context because decoloniality is a more sustained, it sort of repudiates that hybridity of post-coloniality, and decoloniality is a far more profound, decolonizing agenda, which of course in the Russian Ukrainian context means repudiating a fundamental part of Ukraine's history, which is the fact that it had a large Russophone and ethnic Russian population.
I think this is the crux to me as to why I believe the conflict has been misunderstood is that the distinction between, I suppose, what you can call decolonization, which, for lack of a better word, is breaking everything down and trying to rebuild sort of a new society out of the ashes of the Soviet Union in this particular case, and then coming to terms with the post-colonial reality, which would be we accept society of hybrid identities, and inevitably that consequence from that has to be hybrid solutions, right? And that seems to be what is missing here. There seems to be a tendency, particularly on the Ukrainian side, it might also be on the Russian side, to want to impose a particular order on a particular population, and that inevitably bred conflict in a particular Donbass area.
Absolutely. That's the crux of it. The way that I've described this in the past, and people use different terms, but the tension between a monist or single minded vision of Ukrainian identity, which means the attempt to, as it were, to excavate some sort of essence of Ukrainianness, which has endured over 1,000 years and was overlain by Russian colonialism. And this monist vision is that after what they have to do now is to get rid, not just, as I say, the Soviet overlay, but also the whole embeddedness of Russianness in that society, by the way, that attempt to go back to some sort of pure, if you like, national identity, if not necessarily ethnically pure, but identity terms, is also practiced in Estonia and Latvia. And so, which of course, has been highly controversial as well. Slightly different in obviously those two cases, since they were only part of the Soviet Union effectively from 1940, then again from 1944, whereas Ukraine has been entwined. And of course, they were part of the Russian Empire before 1917. So I think this excavation is again, because they've also, those Baltic republics have a Germanic influence as well, which for many years was quite deep. So, and of course, in Ukraine, it's contrasted with the pluralist vision that this would be a multi ethnic, I'd say even go a pluricultural society in which you have different communities living together. It's not just Russians, of course, there's Hungarians and Romanians and other Poles over in, well, not many Poles left, of course, over in the West, but and Romanians. So yeah, and I've always argued that this also needs certain this needs to be entrenched in the constitution, both linguistically and culturally, to allow these institutions to flourish. And it's not a question of inventing the wheel again. Spain after Franco's done it. United Kingdom has done it. Wales is a multi-bilingual province of the United Kingdom, so a principality, let's put it better. So it's nothing new in history, and of course, old South Tyrol, old Odiga in Italy, it goes on and on.
Yeah.
So, but of course, Ukrainian identity after all of this is rather fragile, and so perhaps they overcompensate. They feel that federalization and devolution and linguistic and so on would threaten the unity of the country. The worst thing, of course, is this fear has become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and of course, with catastrophic consequences we see today.
Right. And I suppose this is a point that, I mean, to my astonishment, it has flown over the heads of most Western leaders. They can't come to terms with hybridity. And do you believe that this might be one of the reasons why the global South countries seem to be a little bit more measured in their response to the Russian-Ukraine war, much more understanding that this is not a one-sided affair and there is complexity over there?
Yes, indeed. So the rather exclusivist. I mean, even though even this monist vision can be quite generous, but it would mean accepting. So I mean, I think that few people, including most Russians I know, never complained about about Ukrainian language being developed and privileged. Even that's quite normal. No one objected to it, but it was the lack of balance in what ultimately the system, certainly after the Maidan, after 2014. But as you say, most of the global South, so much as we can see, refusal to join sanctions. Only 49 countries have joined sanctions. Voting in the United Nations do not accept this vision because so many countries in the global South and Africa are made up of dozens, if not hundreds, of different ethnicities and groups, and amazingly enough, many of them, most of them, have held together because of various concessions and balancing. I mean, Nigeria, of course, had a civil war in the 1960s with Biafra and Igbos, but most countries have managed to do it. And yet Ukraine failed spectacularly to build this more generous, inclusive national identity.
Let's start go back maybe again to the reasons as to what they occur before we go into the present times. Ukraine had I mean, you can say somewhat stable government, although 2014, I think it's quite obvious now that was a somewhat of a coup d'etat, although some people would call it still the revolution of dignity. But nonetheless, there was some instability over there. There was the isolation of the Donbas population. There was also the marginalization of the Hungarians, which would explain Hungary's current response to the war itself. Um, and it would have seemed that even, if you were to go back in 2014 or even as far back as Putin's annexation of the Crimea, that somebody should have seen this coming. And there were many leaders, correct, that saw this coming. And why didn't we listen to them? I suppose the obvious question.
There's a whole stack of people within Ukraine whom I've been talking with over decades even, who've been warning about this. So it was quite clear. But what the tragedy of this is that those internal divisions were then exploited by external actors. And I don't mean Russia, I mean the West. And this goes way back, right from the beginning, that, and this is where that post colonial issue comes in, because after 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emergence of 15 post Soviet states, the United States and the Western powers absolutely refused, right from the first day, to allow Russia to manage some sort of hegemonic relationship. Now, by hegemony, I don't mean simple dominance, but given its weight, its economic dominance and cultural and linguistic, of course, um, that and of course, on the one hand, I very much support the emergence, sovereign, independent, democratic, or whatever states they want to be. But at the same time, there had to be some sort of modus vivendi, and then building on the modus vivendi, some sort of more substantive post-Soviet political community to bind this all together. Now, the West absolutely refused to do this. I can give so many examples that they basically said Russia is a former power. Any manifestation of Russian leadership was seen as an attempt to re-establish the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. This was explicitly stated by Hillary Clinton when Putin announced in 2012 the idea of establishing a Eurasian Economic Union. And she said, of course, we know what he wants to do, and we know how to stop it. And of course, this goes way back to the 90s, even before Putin, under Yeltsin. I remember sometime in about 1998, there was a plan to modernize an energy pipeline on the far side, Trans-Caspian, on the far side of the Caspian. And to my astonishment, and this continued into the early 2000s, I stopped counting after 48 Western officials, 48, that's people from the State Department, Energy, European Union, all went there to tell the Central Asian states, don't do it. Now, what on earth had that got to do with them? I mean, this was, one amongst dozens of incidents. I could go on for a long time. Just one final point. Even the first Russian foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, a ardent Atlanticist, a liberal, in the first years after independence in the early 1990s, gave in his book called The Firebird, he gives one instance. For example, there was a discussion about the Armenian-Azerbaijani case conflict, and the Western leaders met in there, and Russia wasn't invited. And this is, right at the beginning, early 1990s. Now, Russia has obviously got, it's a matter of huge concern what was going on there. And even Andrei Kozyrev gives many cases in which Russia's concerns and interests were simply ignored and said, "Your has-been power, forget it." Like our former Defense Secretary Gavin Williamson said in Parliament once about 7 years ago, why doesn't Russia shut up and disappear and go away? So, which is, as about as, as absurd
I mean,
as anything.
was this naivety among, I mean, it's obviously naivety, but we should speak to the naivety of the Western leaders. And I have to say, America in particular, do not want to accept the obvious fact that there are other countries in the world that might have some security interests, that might have a desire to grow economically. And, if I analyze Putin, even going back then, I never got the impression he was anti-Western. He became, over time, much more hardened in his resolve because he was isolated. And sure, there's also Russian nationalism that played maybe a role into that. But it would seem that whenever there's a country that starts to assert itself globally, the Western leaders do not want to tolerate it because they see it as a dominance to their own societies. And I don't even get the impression it is a threat to them.
Yeah, this is lately I've adopted or beginning to get a concept of this, which is rather going back to a rather old-fashioned concept, the old Marxist-Leninist one. Is that, in other words, we have this extraordinary that what I call the political West. That is the alliance led by the United States takes many different forms. One form is NATO. The other one is binding European Union with NATO, which is happening under Ursula von der Leyen at huge speed, and then of course the bilateral security alliances with Japan, South Korea, etc. So this is the political West established and created during the Cold War, uh, and the first signal that this was going to emerge as a power system with global ambitions was, and that there could be when the first time we lost the peace, and that is in 1945. I've been reading a lot lately about nuclear issues, and of course, one of the big arguments always was that the two atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 were not the last battles of the Second World War, but they were the first battles of the Cold War, the emerging Cold War, even though the Soviet Union didn't have nuclear weapons at that stage until 1949. But and that's the way I now see it. That, in other words, this power system, of course, until 1989, while the Soviet Union existed, it was constrained. But that didn't stop the United States launching 54 coups during the Cold War. And of course, since then, many, many more coups, interventions, armed attacks, and so on. And of course, a whole more and more army now of sanctions, which is basically another way of conducting warfare by other means. So, so with this power system, the political West, after the end of the First Cold War, indeed refused to allow Russia any space. And of course, as China re-emerged as a great power in international politics, it too was knocked down. So either the United States cajoles, as it does with India today, and tries to play off the powers against each other to ensure its own power. So indeed, so the whole Marxist-Leninists would be no surprise to them to talk about the imperialist West. Just to say one slight nuance in all of this is that if you want to call it an empire, fine, but there is also in this political West a commonwealth aspect, a public good aspect. Of course, I think much weaker nowadays as US economic dominance is declining. It's resorting more and more to economic warfare, to lawfare, to warfare, to the whole panoply of power, threats, intimidations, and so on. But at the same time, we see that its abnegation of leadership, which in the past it was more flexible, it's also a sclerotic empire. We can see this in its failure to intervene in the Middle East. I mean, I'm talking even before 7th of October. It just simply kicked it into the long touch and was unable to deal, we expect leadership from the United States. It's the greatest power, the most powerful state in the world. And yet, it's natural for it to take a lead, instead of which it's a huge empire, but fails to lead in a positive way to try to manage global affairs. So the bigger on the item and agenda today is after hegemony. After this, because we can no longer trust the United States and its allies. European Union and the legacy great powers have completely marginalized themselves, as we see in the war in Ukraine. So, and lacking any ability to consider European security interests separate from those of the Atlantic system. So this is why. I mean, no one can breathe in this suffocating system of international politics, and the only light in that is that we still have the United Nations international system, the charter system, to which both Russia and China, India, and much of the global South appeals against the usurpation of those principles by the so-called rules-based order.
Yeah, and the rules-based order is, I mean, it's obviously a hypocrisy-based order. It's rules for me, but not rules for thee. And the most obvious example here is Israel. I mean, all the arguments that were thrown against Vladimir Putin when this war started, and rightfully so, if one would take that view, can equally be thrown against Benjamin Netanyahu. Yet one gets military support and weapons, and the other one gets condemned in the media, right? And I don't think. I mean, you have to live under a rock at this stage to think that there is a moral authority still from the rules-based order. At the moment, the debate in the global south is how do we escape this order? How do we try and push back? How do we try and survive and not have a coup d'etat in our background? Because whenever we oppose the United States, that is the response we're going to get.
Absolutely. So the United States and its proxies, and of course Israel now, basically humiliating Iran, Lebanon, and anything around in its locality, and it's still bombing Syria. It's very much on the substantive point. This, political West, double standards are systemic. They're not accidental. It's precisely using that's what a rules-based order actually means. Using the rules as again part of that lawfare, warfare, economic, statecraft, the whole panoply of power to ensure that you maintain your hegemony. So, in other words, the public good side, the Commonwealth side, is gradually, withering away. We saw that when the United States left the Bretton Woods system in August 1971. And since then, it opened the door to financialization and grotesque excesses of contemporary financialized capitalism, neoliberalism. So, yeah, you're absolutely right that it's systemic. It's a double standards are systemic. Use the law when it suits you. Don't use it. So, for example, they used the law against, International Criminal Court against Putin, but when they were talking, against Netanyahu, we see the United States, and in Congress at the moment, I think they're passing a law which is going to criminalize those who collaborate or work or have anything to do with the International Criminal Court. Couldn't be a starker example of that.
As they say, it's the International Kangaroo Court.
Oh, yes.
I'd like to get back, sort of just to focus on the war itself. First of all, on the battlefield itself and what's going on, do you have any insights as to, I mean, it's difficult, obviously, telling who's winning and who's things of this nature, but do you have any insights as to, what's happening on the war front and as to what the attitude in Russia still is towards the war?
Well, on the war front, it's quite clear that incursion into Kursk was ill-considered. I mean, it was, Russian high command. I mean, my people tell me had, they saw what was going on, the build-up of forces on the Ukrainian side, but they thought it was just so mad that they just didn't really think that Zelensky would actually gamble by throwing some of his crack troops into Kursk, including the 82nd, not equivalent to the 82nd Airborne. So it's unbelievable. So, we don't know, 10 to 15,000 at the time when Russia was moving forwards in eastern, western Donbass, moving towards Pokrovsk, Vuhledar to bits further south, Kramatorsk a bit further to the north. So basically, we now know that Ukraine is planning to withdraw its best troops from Kursk. What they're going to do with them is they've been hammered at the moment, so there's not much left of them. Lost enormous amount of equipment. It was a political move rather than a military one, but it weakened Ukraine on the front line. So Russia is advancing. So it's only a question of time. And some analysts are suggesting that this could be just like the Western Front in March 1918 collapsed as the Germans moved forwards. And then, of course, the Germans exhausted themselves, and then they collapsed in turn in August 1918, which led to the armistice in November. So one of those moments, because there's so many, even The Economist, which, if you don't want to know anything serious, go to The Economist on this war. Even they're now accepting that, Ukrainian forces, they don't have enough. They're not trained enough. The British, for example, I think are no longer training Ukrainian forces because they just simply aren't the manpower. People are being picked up in recruiting offices and sent to the front. A lack of ammunition, a lack of guns, a lack of artillery, and above all, a lack of training. So at the first sound of a bomb, they're running. So some people are anticipating a slow motion collapse of the Ukrainian front. And the debate at the moment is, how far will Russia go? Should they go over the Dnieper? Should they take Kiev? And so on. I don't think, on the other hand, Russia doesn't have many forces. I mean, Ukraine still has a huge army, 500,000, Russia, just under 500,000. Russia's got just over 500,000. These are huge armies. So they're still I think that this talk of an imminent Ukrainian collapse is exaggerated, yet they are on the back foot.
Yeah, but one would like for this confrontation to end, and I'll tell you the direct consequence that I know of. I had a friend over here from Russia over the weekend, and he's got friends from Ukraine because, believe it or not, they still socialize.
Mm,
Russians and Ukrainians actually don't hate each other on a human front. And the Ukrainians now are faced with an option. Those who still have visas remaining, say in France or in the UK, cannot get them renewed. And the only way to get them renewed is to go back to Ukraine. But if they go back to Ukraine, they'll be thrown to the front lines. So they're going to be exiled in a certain sense by their visas expiring. And their safest option at the moment is to go to Russia because there they can get protection. So that's the insanity of this, is that the safest option for the Ukrainians outside of it to not go back on the front lines is to go to Russia for protection. Okay,
yeah,
so the whole
it's
thing is nuts in so
yeah,
many ways.
absolutely. It's already since 2014, we don't know the figures, but perhaps 2.5 million, 3 million Ukrainians have gone to Russia. So the single largest quotient, even before this latest passport issue, had gone there. But now even those who wanted to go west, who were never particularly sympathetic to Russia as such, to the regime, if you want to put it this way, um, yes, they're being forced to go if they don't want to go to the front line, where the average life expectancy is a matter of days.
Yeah, and I mean, the statistic that's in my head is that the average or the median age of the Ukrainian army is like 45.
Yeah,
Okay,
it was
so
43 was the figure they gave. Yep, exactly.
43. Okay, so it's
Yes,
it's it's old men. I mean, wars are fought by young men. The war shouldn't be fought to
absolutely.
begin with. So
Yes.
it's just crazy. Now, let me ask you on the political side. I mean, the United States has an election coming up. Donald Trump has said it in public that Zelensky is a salesman or something of the sort. He
Mm,
comes to Washington, he gets money every single time. So it doesn't seem to be that the Republicans at least have the willingness still to fund the war. The Democrats, on the other hand, are doubling down on this, right? And do you suspect that if Trump wins, would this end? Is that a possibility?
mm. Yeah, it certainly is. The thing about Trump, as we know, his unpredictability and his susceptibility to flattery, and he's also in Trump one was he appointed all sorts of people. I'm thinking about Mike Pompeo and others, really, and of course, other people who are really militant. So that's why when Putin was slightly teasing when he said he would preferred initially Biden and then Kamala to Trump, because it was Trump who imposed, um, who started selling transfers, really serious arms, which Obama hadn't done to Ukraine. And also, there's also the fact that Trump is a 120% behind Israel. So there's no flexibility. Um,
Yes.
so, uh, you
And,
know,
and Trump will definitely accelerate the possibility of a war with Iran because I was in Iran shortly after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, and I'm saying that I mean that country was on edge at the time.
yeah.
Okay, so that it's not a Trump. I'm saying let's vote for Trump because he's coming with his own set of problems. But towards the Ukrainian war, I mean, at least what he's saying at the moment seems to be more measured than the Democrats. But we're talking about measures of extremes at the moment because the U.S. leadership is so fanatical about this issue. They can't come to negotiate.
Mm. Yes, it is that, yeah, and you're quite right. Is that the second Trump administration, if it happens, will I think be very different from the first. So there will be. He may have learned some of the lessons. So it'll certainly shake things up. That's for sure. Even for NATO won't be the way. And my prediction is that whoever wins this election, unless it's a clear majority. I mean, it looks like Kamala Harris is going to win the popular vote, and that's happened many times. Uh, but the electoral college will be far more balanced. It's too close to call at the moment, but given that whoever wins this election, there's going to be an extended time of turbulence. If not, some people even talk about civil war. I think that's, but certainly turbulence, let's put it this way, for several months after the election, even once they come into power. So I don't anticipate that. But what that will allow is allowing Russia and there perhaps there won't be funneling so many weapons. But of course, the Europeans are now stepping up and trying to Trump-proof all the arms supply and financial supply to Ukraine to keep the war going for another year, because their view is that Russia will be exhausted by 2026, and economic crisis will hit the country at that point.
So two questions on that. One, do you believe that the European publics are in agreement with what their leadership is doing? And then the second one is, how stable is Vladimir Putin's government still?
It's quite clear that popular opinion is beginning to turn against this endless um, commitment to a war. I mean, hopefully some sort of reasonably just settlement could emerge. But, when you say the publics, we've just had an election, as you know, in the United Kingdom. We've had Keir Starmer elected, and there's almost minimal debate over foreign policy. Of course, one of the first things that Starmer and our foreign minister, David Lammy, did was to go to Kiev and promise endless support. Then, as you know, Starmer with Lammy went to Washington on the 13th of September, begging Biden to allow Zelensky to use storm shadows to attack Russian mainland. And of course, he returned to London like a whipped dog because he didn't get it, which was quite humiliating. At the same time, they're committing funds. This just lately £600 million, but more to come. 3 billion has been committed. At the same time that they've cut pensioners' fuel allowance, which is going to save maybe maximum 1.2 billion, if that. So it immediately showed most starkly what this government thinks is important, which is going to, there's a slow motion backlash. My local MP, Rosie Duffield, you may have heard, she resigned on Saturday and published an excoriating letter about the shambles and of this government and how it's betrayed its principles. That's a sign that even within the Labour Party, there's a lot of discontent about this policy. As for Putin's, I think there is no evidence of any substantive threat to his rule. The popularity level is still in the top upper 70s, and this is figures from the independent pollster, the Levada Center. So he's still popular. There is no real sense of intra-elite splits on the war. More than that, talking to Russian citizens, no one, I mean, very few people I've met are enthusiastic about the war. There's no jingoism, there's no gung-ho sense, but there's a certain sense of sad and grim determination to get the job done. Their argument, and there's something to be said for it, is they brought the war to us and that we have to do this. And just one thing on the nuclear issue, which we often forget, that in many ways, this war is a result of that long-term strategy of the United States, even during the first Cold War, but certainly all the way through since 1989, is the goal of nuclear primacy. That in the late 50s and 60s, there was a debate, but the maximalists seem to have won. And that's why the United States withdrew from an ABM treaty in June 2002. And Putin has said it more than once that ultimately that was the key issue, is that the United States is going for nuclear primacy. What that means is that they could win, and the belief amongst their nuclear partners is that they could win a nuclear war, that they could put in a devastating first strike. And then you have this ABM stuff, those two units which they have installed in Romania and Poland, in California and Alaska and elsewhere, that they could actually then mop up anything that Russia could throw at them. Then you'd say, look, what about the nuclear submarines? Well, the US is quietly confident that it's even these Russian nuclear submarines, that they can track them, and that if in a close to war, they would be able to sink them. before
Well,
they can
a
release. I mean,
few,
it's mad, but
few obvious problems as somebody who works in the nuclear industry with that theory. Number one, if you blow up a city, let's assume they blow up Moscow, even with Moscow's own nukes, the smog will rise into the stratosphere and cause winter across the planet and destroy the prospects of organized life on this planet. So it's already nuts, even on the assumption that the US thinks they can do what they're doing. I mean, the whole thing is crazy. So the weapons are useless. And, I mean, unless they're crazy enough to use it in this stage, I don't know who's crazy enough because it's just not, it just won't work. The other question on nuclear primacy, which is not mentioned yet, is Russia currently dominates the export markets of nuclear reactors. In fact, most of the reactors built in China at the moment are Russian. And the Russians have exported nuclear technology as a means for climate and also for their own dominance across the world. And the United States does not tolerate this. Okay, and it's even hitting as far as South Africa when they said they want to build a reactor a few years ago. They spread a story in the media that we signed a deal with Russia, though the evidence was very flimsy about it, for example. So that is another thing that the entire nuclear supply chain, okay, is being politicized by the United States. And one reason I suspect they do it is because of all the five major vendor countries, the United States is the worst performing one compared to France, South Korea, China, and Russia. So it's again this idea if we cannot beat them in competition, we will ban them and we will, try and eliminate them through sanctions and to use whatever we can at our disposals to make sure that they do not succeed.
absolutely, absolutely, it's that sign of this political West led by the US. They've gone nuts. We could say they've gone rogue, ultimately undermining their own logic, of course, their own welfare, uh, by this, dog in a manger attitude. If they can't do it, then no one else can either.
Yeah, exactly. The other question I have here is on France. So we had the European elections in Europe where Macron was basically humiliated, and then he tried to, I mean, doing something again idiotic, where he said, "Okay, I'm going to have a popular vote," and then the population didn't vote for the right; they vote for the left.
Yeah. Mm.
Okay, now he's sitting, and we can't form a parliament in France at the moment because the opposition that he has to go to keep out the Assemblée Nationale, the former Front National, is basically anti-war.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, yeah, indeed. And I think the appointment of Michel Barnier as Prime Minister, with basically a tacit support, and a government full of Les Républicains, it's a fundamentally unstable construct. Um, and so one can anticipate that Macron is, as you suggest, a wounded leader. And it's not quite clear that whether he could stagger on until the next presidential election, which I think is due in 2027. So it's quite possible there'll be an earlier one. But of course, Macron has turned out to be, uh, you know, how can I put it, one of the strongest war hawks in Europe today.
yes, a big disappointment because in the beginning of this war, he said, "I want to implement the Minsk II protocols," which made
Yes,
complete sense to anyone who followed it. Said the right things and then did the opposite. But
yeah.
it's not unusual in French politics to find that.
But he's an extreme example of it.
Yeah.
And I mean, he's given some superb speeches, and then when there's been no follow up.
Correct. So last question for you is, what do you think is the best case scenario of us getting out of this war? And I guess by extension, you can ask the war in Israel, Palestine, because in a way they are also
Oh
related.
yes.
You
It's you could say both these wars are wars of the crisis of US hegemony, or its failure to achieve leadership, or when it does exercise leadership, it's perverse and malicious and just intensifies and exacerbates conflicts. For example, the Abraham Accords were a way of marginalizing Palestinian concerns. So, and instead of devoting efforts to implementing United Nations resolutions, and above all, those in favor of a two-state solution, and facilitating it. There's faults, of course, within the Palestinian communities. I'm certainly not, I mean, Mohammed Abbas at the head of the PLO or Palestinian Authority is clear there should have been elections years ago and renewal of leadership there. But also, I think the United States failed to exercise leadership. And of course, in Ukraine, as I say, for 30 years, its leadership has been malicious. Always, the idea that Russia and Ukraine to get together was going to threaten US hegemony, and they certainly weren't going to allow it. Also, another malicious sign is that energy relationship between Germany and Russia, which of course would have been, fundamental to European stability and deeper. But the United States, from the very first time when the first contract was signed in 1970, has opposed it. So, first Cold War, end of Cold War, Cold Peace, all those times, all the way till today, there's virulent hostility to what would be a pan-continental energy network. And of course, with overflow, yes, it would have been political, and it would have avoided this war. So you're absolutely right that in other words, to understand the Ukraine war and the Palestinian Middle East is that we have to understand it as a larger conflict or larger thing of the decline of effective US leadership and its hijacking by neoconservative and liberal internationalist visions which are running against the United Nations. Hence, why on earth didn't they, put some pressure on Israel to implement those? Everybody's was in favor of a two-state solution, and it would have precisely stopped and saved Israel from so much suffering which it has endured. So, and of course, and it would have avoided the war in Ukraine, because I've always argued from the very first time we talked, I said this was one of the most easily avoidable wars in history. There's no fundamental conflict between Russia and Ukraine, absolutely none. The conflict was one, of course, there was internal. We talked about the identity issues, but that could have been, one way or another, and the balance would have tilted at the next elections, and Maidan would have just, been the endless pendulum until someone in Ukraine had come to power and resolved it by genuine turning it into a pluricultural, constitutionally entrenched, pluralistic society, and that would have happened. But
Well, the best article on this, Richard, is in The Nation. It was written, I think, 2018 or 19, by Anatol Heaven, where he wrote that I can't remember the title now, but basically he ended up with saying this is actually the most dangerous conflict in the world. It's the easiest to solve because the agreement's already there. And I would actually say the Israeli-Palestine one is very similar. Everyone in the United States, nations except 5 countries, the US, Israel, and 3 islands, agrees that the two-state solution has to be implemented. Okay, I don't think that's possible there anymore, but either way, those conceptual frameworks where the diplomatic agreements were signed, you just had to implement what you signed. It was not as more difficult than that. And they could not come to a point of accepting that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Richard, just a last follow-up on this very last question. The people who would criticize you and me and others on this war, they would say that we are only giving the Russian perspective of the war. We only put in talking points or things of that nature to the extreme. I mean, what is your response to that?
Well, I think that's quite wrong. What we're giving is a balanced analysis. So we give a balanced analysis because we're analyzing internal Ukrainian issues as well, which reflects a very strong tide of opinion, and the vast majority of Ukrainians whom, when they voted for Zelensky in April 2019, and he got that 73%, he was standing as the peace candidate. Ukrainians wanted peace. How they were going to get it, I don't know. Unfortunately, that political community was hijacked by the ultra-nationalists supported by the West. So do we give? I'm giving voice to the other Ukraine. So that's not a Moscow voice; it's the other Ukrainian voice. And as for my critique of the political West, this is something which it doesn't entirely coincide with the Russian critique, but I think the Russian critique and the Beijing critique, by the way, and so much of the global South is a valid one. That doesn't mean to say that we endorse internal developments within Russia. We have criticism of that. Of course, we'd like to see, rather more open system. But in as far as the international geopolitics is concerned, this is the line which I've been pursuing well before Putin. And as I said, I quote Andrei Kozyrev at the beginning of the Yeltsin years. NATO enlargement without a mediating framework, some pan-European framework, was inevitably going to lead to conflict, especially when it was overlain by these nuclear issues, which we've just talked about, as well as these cultural and identity issues. So this was a predictable war, a predicted war, and an avoidable war. And it's ultimately pointless. Ultimately pointless. Russia did not invade Ukraine because it wanted to re-establish an empire or land grab. It was all about security. And that is a view which is valid in Moscow, Beijing, San Francisco, or New York. But unfortunately, not particularly
I would say the international community, the true definition of the of the word.
Instead of which, it's falsification, endless talk that it's an empire, and that the danger for Russia was that a sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine was a threat to Russia. Of course, it doesn't. There's all sorts of democratic countries. Mongolia, for example, Putin just visited Mongolia. It's a highly democratic country, and Russia doesn't see that as a threat. Why should it?
Exactly. Well, Richard, Sakwa, thank you for this conversation, and thank you everybody for listening. Please share it around.